Good morning to everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Tara Green with Building a Thriving Compassionate Community, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Today, we are joined by Carrie Mixa and Jenny Robinson with the Indiana Coalition for Public Education, Monroe County. I'm excited for their topic today called Can Schools Work Magic Out of Thin Air? How COVID exposes Indiana's unsustainable K-12 funding. Excited about that topic. I have a few logistics to help our session flow. We also have with us today Bridget Nasby from the Youth Services Bureau. She's our Zoom host today. So if you have any technical questions, you can message her individually in the chat. In the chat feature, you can see where it says to, and you can do a drop down and send a message specifically to a certain person. We're going to ask that you have your mute buttons on for now. We will be opening it up for discussion a little bit later. But until then, we request that you hold your questions and comments so that we can really focus on what the presenters have to share, and then we'll open it up to everyone. We will be recording today's presentation. We'll do the presentation portion of the session so that we can have it available on the BTCC website for viewing later, but we won't record the discussion at the end so that participants can feel comfortable interacting a little bit more openly. And then the slides that you see today we'll put on the BTCC website in the coming days so that you can know that you don't have to take ferocious notes if you don't want to. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. Carrie and Jenny, welcome and thank you for sharing your ideas with us.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us, Tara. We're super happy to be here today. And thank you also to everybody who's in the audience. I can't see you. I don't know who you are, but I would love to. So if you have a chance, if you feel comfortable and want to put your name and organization in the chat, that would be great. Again, I'm Jenny with the Indiana Coalition for Public Education of Monroe County, and our topic today is the structure of school funding in Indiana and what is wrong and unsustainable about it. So Carrie and I are going to give the presentation together. We'll go back and forth every several slides, and I can tell you a little bit about how I got involved in advocating for public schools because it very much had to do with money. My oldest daughter was in kindergarten when Governor Daniel slashed the state school budget during the recession, so that was 2009. And in response to that, our community passed a referendum, which is a local property tax for the schools. And I walked door to door for that, talking about the programs we wanted to keep in our schools. And then after it passed, and thank goodness that it passed, I really wanted to know how that money was going to be spent. So I went to the budget presentations that the school board was doing. Even as I got sort of obsessed with following the school board, some experienced and very wise educators locally were saying that what was happening was very much related to state policies. And these folks went on to found a local branch of a new group that was forming, the Indiana Coalition for Public Education.
All right. Hi, I am Carrie Mixa. I am Vice Chair of ICP Monroe County. I found my way into public school advocacy back when the iStep Plus came out and was clocking in at over 14 hours for a third grader during the 2014-15 school year. My eldest daughter was just a first grader then, and I just didn't understand what happened to public education in Indiana while our family was living outside of the state between the key years of 2007 and 2011. A lot happened. So I inquired a lot about how this came to be in various Facebook groups and found myself and my daughters at the ICPE State House rally to support Glenda Ritz on President's Day back in 2015. It was a massive event and it was very moving. And since then, I've been an active member of ICPE. Let's see, I'm advancing my slide. There we go. So what is ICPE? We are a nonprofit and nonpartisan group. We advocate for all children to have high quality, equitable, well-funded schools that are subject to democratic oversight by their communities. We organize forums and events about issues in public education. We send out calls to action about legislation that affects public education. We rally at the State House every President's Day. We join the state level group and participate in this event. We fund a pro-public education lobbyist through our state level organization. And by the way, our state level organization, our current president up there is actually down here in Monroe County. It's Kathy Fuentes-Rohrer. We issue a report card for legislators every 2 years based on their votes. And by we, I mean the state level issues this and we share it widely. Locally, we help support a PAC at the state level that contributes to candidates who are pro-public ed. Locally, we attend school board meetings for charter schools and public schools. We host school board candidate forums every 2 years, and we have an active website at keepeducationpublic.org.
So I love the theme that BTCC is returning to for this summit, that what surrounds us shapes us, and the invitation to think about equity. And I think for most of us, school is a major factor in what surrounds us in some of our most crucial years of development, childhood through adolescence. So thinking about those safe, stable, nurturing relationships, the relationships that we develop with peers and with teachers, with caring adults outside the family matter so much. The physical school buildings that we spend our days in matter, whether they are clean, spacious, well ventilated, well lit, free from pollutants. Do they have libraries? Do they have green space that we can access, and arts and sports? Do we get to play and explore? Most importantly, do we have professional educators who can teach us, guide us, inspire love of learning, and model inquiry and disagreement and the negotiation of conflict? Do we have access in school to the tools and information we need to develop our full potential to participate as citizens in a democracy? The quality and characteristics of our schools depend on community and government support. They depend on funding. So that's why when we think about equity, at some level, we really need to keep in mind these very basic, unglamorous questions, like money. Where is it coming from? Do we have enough of it? Who is making decisions about the budget for schools? And do schools that serve high-need populations receive the appropriate extra levels of support? So that's why our presentation today is about school funding in Indiana. And if we care about equity, we have to care about public schools' stability and resources. And that means we have to care that our public schools are adequately funded.
Okay. So our group, ICPE, Monroe County, we've done some thinking about why public schools matter and what is unique and important about them. And here are 6 reasons. Public schools are the foundation of democracy. In public schools, students learn to get along with others of diverse backgrounds and beliefs. Public schools reflect a community's investment in children and the future. Public schools carry a community's history and memory. Public schools must accept all students and serve all families of all abilities, religions, races, and economic situations. And public schools belong to us. We, the public, the community, have a voice in our public schools through elected boards.
So all those 6 reasons on the last slide are sort of big picture and abstract, but our public schools are also important just because they support kids' social, physical, and emotional development through peer interactions, collaboration, through PE and sports, through the arts and music and theater, through the work of social workers and counselors. And to this list, I would add that schools are also providing a level of practical service and wraparound care that the pandemic has really brought into sharp relief, that they're providing food, breakfasts and lunches, and childcare for families that enables parents to go to work. They're a really key part of our social safety net. Because childcare is essential for the economic engine of the country to hum along, the act of opening schools has become very politicized right now, and there are super weird cross currents happening. So we've got politicians who've never cared particularly about funding schools, now really wanting them to get back in operation for the economy. And so they're talking about children's health as it relates to school, even though they never seemed to care too much about that before and only wanted to grade our schools based on standardized test scores. And our group is absolutely committed to the idea that schools support and must support children's health. The operating in person is tremendously valuable if it can be done safely, and that schools need resources to do that. Or I should go back and say if risk can be adequately mitigated in this moment. It's a really strange moment when it's convenient for politicians who've never truly sided with schools to be using some of our points about how they support children's health and asserting that schools are crucial in that way.
Okay. Let's look for a moment at who is in Indiana schools. Here is the most recent data from the Indiana Department of Ed. We pulled this from Dr. McCormick's most recent slideshow, all this data. And it aggregates the info from all types of schools that are receiving public funding, public, private, and charter. Bear in mind, these numbers are from before the pandemic. So last year, there were over 1 million students. They speak almost 300 languages. 6% were English language learners. Almost half of Indiana's students were on free or reduced lunch. 15% were in special education, and there were almost 2,000 migrant children. And finally, there were over 17,000 children in unstable housing last year. There we go. And public schools serve the overwhelming majority of students. 9 in 10 students in Indiana last year were in public schools. This year, across our state and nationally, enrollment in public schools has dropped. We don't know yet where students have gone. Anecdotally, the drop seems most severe at the younger grade levels. Are people homeschooling or seeking out private schools, which began the year in person? We'll likely learn more in December or January when the state releases a report on where students are transferring. In any case, because of Indiana's problematic funding model, the drop in enrollment is likely to lead to a funding crisis.
And so now just moving to the question specifically about how funding works in Indiana. So since about 2011, and other parts of this were introduced earlier, but dramatically starting in 2011, we have what are sort of family of policies that are called school choice policies by often the people promoting them. But what this means is that family decisions can determine where education money is flowing. So if you send your kid to a voucher or to a charter school, the state tuition support is going to go to the school the child attends. So on the surface, that can just sound very common sense and good. But in practice, it leads to funding instability for our common schools. And what is happening in Indiana is that the money follows the child out of the public infrastructure into private and privately managed schools. And while the money is following the child, the rights are not following the child. These schools are not part of systems that have an obligation to serve all students. So a school district, as Carrie mentioned before when she was talking about the 6 reasons that public schools are important, is that a school district really is obligated to serve every single child in that district. But these other forms that we have in this competitive environment now are not accountable to the community through elected boards. They appoint their own boards. Some are contracted out to for-profit entities, and maybe more importantly, they do not have to serve any and every child who shows up at the door.
Okay, so the next few slides, it's all about money. And we're just going to illustrate where some of the money's going. And it's not some, it's quite a bit. Here's the growth in vouchers. You can see the growth in attendance and spending. About $1 billion has been spent on vouchers in Indiana since it started back in 2011. Just to qualify, a voucher is a state taxpayer money that is used to help a family pay for a student's private school tuition. Many private schools charge tuition that is thousands of dollars more than the voucher amount. So it's really just like a little bit of a scholarship. And that voucher that you get depends on the school district of residence and the family's income. The average voucher is just under $5,000. But when you compare that to, for instance, Cathedral High School in Indianapolis, they're charging yearly $15,700. So you can see how these vouchers only account for a small little scholarship. And it's important to note that Cathedral received about $1.2 million from the state last year in voucher money. Let's see. And then we have charter schools. Charter schools are also pulling families and funds from public schools. traditional public schools. Here is the growth from 2010. Charter schools have been around since 2002 in Indiana, but in order to keep things consistent, I stuck with the 2010 starting point. But you can see charter school attendance has been growing, and we've been spending a lot of money there, $2 billion since 2010. I'm sorry, there's a correction there. It's since 2010, not 2011. It's important to note that charter schools have been growing in number, but while they've been growing in number, there are still some that have been closing along the way. So when one closes, another opens, and when another closes, a couple more open. But it's a significant chunk of money that's leaving the tuition support fund, going towards non-public, non-traditional public schools.
So here, when you look at the schools that are being funded by the state in Monroe County, I think it's really instructive and interesting to compare 2008 to 2020. So back in 2008, we just had the 2 public school districts that were receiving taxpayer dollars here in the county. And then with a raft of legislation starting in 2011, really, we've seen that expand. So now, as well as the 2 public school districts with the number of schools in those, we also have 2 local charter schools, 5 private schools that accept vouchers, and then also several virtual schools that children in Monroe County are also attending virtually. So the state tuition dollars are now not concentrated in the public schools, but are leaving. And I always think it's instructive to think about, again, what it means to be public. If you look at the local newspaper and what decisions they're reporting on, they will be, thank goodness, regularly at our public school district board meetings. And it's quite rare that we see reports about the board meetings of charter schools, or obviously about the private schools, which certainly have no obligation to have. I mean, I've never seen a report that had a private school board meeting in a newspaper. So again, among these school types, public schools are the ones that are legally obligated to serve all children in the community. And then if we look at the local impact of this in terms of the funding, it's was $5.5 million last year that MCCSC and RBB lost between the different types of schools that were also receiving state tuition support.
Okay. All right. So this is a fun slide, not really. Basically, the funding for public education, on top of all of these losses, the funding for public education in Indiana is not keeping up with the rate of inflation. Since 2009, the state has controlled the majority of public school funding. But over the past decade, the state has not properly funded public schools. You can see here the rate of inflation from 2010 to 2019 is 18.76%. But tuition support budget has only increased 14.81%. Considering that difference, the budget for tuition support is short $253.5 million. So with all of these funding losses, Indiana has now become a referendum state. Some things to consider. There are 2 other funding models, funding problems to add to the mix. In 2009, Governor Daniels cut $300 million from public school budgets. Overnight here locally, we know that MCCSC lost roughly $3 million in state revenue. And then in 2010, we have property tax caps that strained local funding. And property tax caps, if you recall, it's that 1% on homesteads, 2% on farms, and 3% on other property. That's what I'm referring to in regards to caps. The result of all this is a lack of funding, state and local. So all the past slides that we had all the money, we have a lack of funding. And so now we're relying heavily on referendums. It is a local means that communities have to maintain the quality and variety of public school programs. And it's a pretty popular solution, as you can see from this map here. And it's in the success rate and the number of referenda that have been passed, it's in the upper 20% of schools and the lower 20% of schools, because those are the ones that are hurting the most. Between 2002 and 2008, only 6 school referenda were passed in Indiana. Since 2008, close to 200 have been on the ballot. About 1/3 of all school districts, 291 school districts, have tried to pass a referendum and have received mixed results. The most on the ballot since 2010 occurred this past May. In that election, 18 were on the ballot and 16 passed. That was during a pandemic, this pandemic that we're in right now. It's proving that people believe in public education no matter what. Right now, there are 4 on the ballot, by the way: Gary, Indiana, Southeast Du Bois, Bremen, and Wawasee. Those are urban and rural districts. They are all financially strapped. And you can see also on this map, the red, those are the failed referenda. When a referendum fails, things are cut, class sizes go up, teacher salaries remain stagnant while their healthcare costs go up, programs disappear, schools close. MCCSC's referendum provides a lot. It's very important to note that it's hard to get voters to approve a referendum. As I mentioned earlier, only 1/3 of districts have attempted to pass a referendum. 2/3 don't, because they know it is just incredibly difficult to do. It's a very hard ask for community members that are already financially strapped to pay more taxes. RBB has never tried to pass a referendum. MCCSC, on the other hand, has passed 2, one in 2010 and again in 2016, because these tax levies expire and we need to continue them. In both years, they authorize a 6-year referendum. The current one is 11.5 cents per 100 net assessed valuation. This referendum is not for more things in majority of school districts. These are operational referendums. They're there to maintain status quo. This referendum in MCCSC was originally passed due to a funding cut from the state at the time of the Great Recession. If anyone in this room had children in MCCSC back then, they will recall a number of teachers were ripped, world languages were cut from middle schools, class sizes in elementary schools ballooned, among other things. The referendum was passed, and it helps pay for the salaries and benefits for 81 of our district's educators. That's about 10% of the teaching staff. It maintains class sizes, provides world languages in the middle schools, experiential learning at Hunting Creek and Bradford Woods, alternative high school education, nurses, custodians, preschool classrooms, literacy intervention programs, after school activities. It is a significant chunk of the operating budget for MCCSC. Their referendum will be up again for renewal in 2022.
So when we turn now to the pandemic, I'm sure everybody is aware of how much the expectations have grown for our schools, and along with those expectations come extra costs. So now schools across Indiana are working hard to provide both in-person and online education at the same time, but without an increase in the budget to do that. So I believe this is a tremendously stressful environment for teachers, as they have not been able to clone themselves. One option that some school districts are turning to is to, find a provider of online services. I'm really grateful locally that we have actual local teachers who are teaching the online option for those who want it. Obviously, along with this comes a need to do professional development. So many of our very experienced teachers had not had training on using Zoom, for instance, or other classroom management systems that help people navigate that. So That's one cost. Technology upgrades, again, locally, we were very fortunate in MCCSC that we already had the one-to-one device program. Many schools did not. And then there's this sense that schools need to provide internet to schools who do not already have it. And again, this is a case where schools are stepping in to provide a real social need, but you wouldn't necessarily from the outside look at it and say, oh, it's like educators' job to provide what really should be a public utility at this point. But certainly schools are stepping up to do it because no one else is doing it for them. Then, of course, there's the cleaning costs, the PPE, trying to ventilate schools adequately, upgrade systems, sort of prepare outdoor spaces so they can also be used for classrooms. And then there's the fact that buses and classrooms really should not have as many people in them. So you either double the size of your bus fleet, and schools don't have funds for that, or you double the routes. And again, that's more labor. Ideally, there would be fewer students in the classrooms and you would need more teachers. So there are many more costs right now, and this is all coming on top of what's been effectively, decreased funding for years.
Yeah, so as we were saying, we are financially hurting, and COVID has created a perfect storm for a school funding crisis. Our funding sources are strained. State tuition support is funded by sales tax, and consumer spending significantly dropped during the pandemic. It is also funded by income tax, and many Hoosiers lost their jobs during the pandemic. Local funds are dependent on property tax payments, and property owners, both commercial and residential, are deferring on their payments due to loss of income. And finally, the enrollment has suddenly dropped this fall in public schools, especially for lower grades. As we said earlier, the money follows the child, so this is incredibly painful. The Herald Times reported that MCCSC's student count dropped by 7%, which would mean a loss of $5.2 million.
So now 2021 is one of the long sessions. In Indiana, we alternate between long and short sessions of the legislature. This is a long session, and we all are sort of quaking in our shoes at this point because the long session, frankly, is just an opportunity to do more damage. It's also the really high stakes session where they set the budget for the next 2 years. So we know that big decisions happen in budget years. Good things can happen or bad things can happen. So if we're looking at possible ways that public schools could be further weakened, these are things that we would expect. One, that the tuition support budget would be cut, and that would likely just be because of the financial pressure on the state right now and not enough money coming into the state coffers. We've seen in the last several years efforts to bring in educational savings accounts, which are sort of like vouchers on steroids. That's when you basically just give like a debit card to parents to say spend on education. So we expect to see that return. We're concerned that there might be legislation that would mandate that referendum money be shared with charter schools. Again, this is really painful because the existence of charter schools competing for families and funding is part of the reason that schools need referenda. And so then to have to turn around and share that just feels like, you're trying to patch your boat on one end, and on the other side, the money's just pouring out. Mandating that property taxes be shared with charter schools. This is something that also we've been seeing people try to lay the groundwork for. And very interestingly, the term that's being used to call for this is equity. And it's interesting, charter schools do not receive at this point property tax money. So they receive that state tuition support chunk, but they don't receive the property taxes that pay for the transportation and the building infrastructure and all of that. And so when you go back to how they were presented to the Indiana public, it was as a sort of cheaper, more efficient way to educate children. But it does turn out that it costs money to educate children. And and to provide them stability. Of course, our group feels that that should be in schools that really do belong to the public and cannot just contract with for-profit entities, for instance, to provide that. We also expect to see legislation that would expand vouchers. That has happened in almost every session since 2011, so that's certainly headed our way again. And then lastly, it's quite likely that we'll see an effort to merge the Higher Education Commission with the Department of Education, and possibly eventually with the Department of Workforce Development, because we certainly have a number of people in the legislature who do feel that education is in service of the economy primarily, and that we need to develop workers, and that's the goal of education. So if you're coming at it from that angle, then having the DOE housed in the Department of Workforce Development would make sense. So on the other hand, there is the potential for good legislation, and things that we would love to see would be an increase in the tuition support budget, more funding for teacher salaries, eliminating some unneeded state mandates. Public schools need to follow the law, and there's a whole lot of law now governing public schools. So it could perhaps be trimmed down somewhat. We'd love to see schools held harmless for the results of the standardized tests. And even better yet, let's not administer them, because we know that there is nothing standardized about this pandemic environment. It would be great to ditch iRead3. That's the third grade reading test that just punitively threatens retention for students who have not made the, according to the test, the right amount of progress. We'd love to see a moratorium on charter schools. That would not mean closing down existing schools. What that would do would be to say, press pause and evaluate the program and not open more of them in this environment where existing schools are already struggling for funding. And certainly with vouchers, the same thing. And then eliminating textbook fees. We're supposed to have a free and appropriate public education, but textbooks cost money, and textbooks, of course, help deliver the curriculum. So we really don't have a free education in Indiana, though we receive so very much through our schools. And now, so the fate of our schools is really in the hands of our legislators. This audience, I believe, knows how essential public schools are to our community. It's why we've pushed hard to have them be able to open safely during the pandemic. Almost every service group represented here is likely connected to the schools in some way. So we are really hoping to resist public policies that privilege the choices of some and limit the choices of others. There are things that you can do. Talk with your legislator, meet with them in person, write or call, testify for or against a bill at the State House, check in on your children's teachers and ask how they're doing, and talk to other people, your friends, your neighbors, about the values of public schools and the things that they're providing to us. And then vote for public education. We also would love to have people join our group. There's power in numbers, and we need to see change. So we're just hoping to build more knowledge. And thank you. Vote for public education. And Carrie, sorry, this is your slide. I started in on this one.
I am, okay, here we go. I'm back on. Yes, I was going to just restate, it's in order to support public schools, you have to vote for public education. And voting for public education means you vote for candidates that support your public schools. Elected officials these elected officials will then vote for laws that lift up public schools and children instead of selling them off for a profit. To quote Dr. McCormick, to quote Dr. McCormick, she is Indiana's last superintendent of public instruction. At the end of the day, the question should not be what side of the aisle you are on, but are you on the side of kids? And of course, please join us. Thank you so much.